Hi everyone. In this video I want to look at some case studies of 19th century, late 19th century European conquest of South African chiefdoms. And in doing so, hopefully we can notice some of the themes we talked about last time, the importance of the control of land, the European desire to have Africans act as laborers, and the various incentives and conditions they created to make sure that that was a necessity for the Africans, as well as things like rinderpest and other diseases and the effects that those had in all of this. Right. We also mentioned the importance of white unity and kind of the fragmentation of the Black Africans. And so we'll see that as we look at these case studies. This is not an exhaustive rendering of all of those, but it does look at some of the more important examples. And so the first of these is the Zulu. Okay, so we've traced the Zulu from their formation under Shaka up through the mid to late 19th century. Under the reign of the Zulu king Cetshwayo, who is pictured here in the upper left, the Zulu became more and more reliant on the British. Okay. This was especially the case after the annexation of the Transvaal. If you recall, the Afrikaners, the Trekboers, or rather the Voortrekkers, had crossed the Drakensberg, gone down into Natal, fought against the Zulu, defeated them in a couple of battles, but then the British had subsequently annexed Natal, prompting most of those Afrikaners to return to the plateau, to the Highveld. This sort of left the Zulu under the protection of the British, and figures like Theophilus Shepstone, who is also pictured here, acted as sort of paternalistic protectors and representatives of the Zulu. We read in the Hamilton book about Shepstone and his interaction with Cetshwayo, his acting in the coronation of Cetshwayo as Shaka himself. Right, so he understood how to kind of manipulate the Zulu using their own traditions, but at the same time, and I think Hamilton is right to point out that Shepstone himself was manipulated. That the Zulu saw, Shepstone as a path to overcome their enemies, and exploited him in a way similar to the way that he was trying to exploit them. Okay. Now the thing about Shepstone and other British figures who were involved in the Zulu is that even though they were on intimate terms with their Zulu interlocutors, there's an example that Thompson gives in the textbook of a British merchant named John Dunn, who in trading with the Zulu and interacting with them ended up acquiring almost chief status among the Zulu. He had, I think, 40-something Zulu wives. He had massive herds of cattle. He had his own kraal among the Zulu, right? And so, I mean, some of these British figures were very heavily involved, even on a kind of intimate basis with the Zulu. But when it came down to it, they had to make a choice of whether to support not just British claims to the Zulu, but even even those of Afrikaners. People like Shepstone and Dunn turned against the Zulu. Now, what that says about British attitudes toward Africans in this period, I think, is quite telling, right? That their loyalty lay to their fellow Europeans. That even if they were intimately involved with the Zulu, this was done on definitely not on an equal basis with them, at least as they conceived it, right? When the Afrikaners continued to make land claims even after the annexation of Natal by the British, Shepstone turned against the Zulu, okay, and sort of cast them to their own fate, and supported other whites in these regards. The British, as we said, annexed Transvaal in 1877, and just to clarify all this, prompted some of these Afrikaners to reaffirm their land claims in Natal, and there was some disputed land on the border here, and Shepstone decided to side with the Afrikaners, even though he had sort of been their enemy previous to this point. And Shepstone then decreed, or rather the British government in Natal decreed, that the Zulu needed to renounce these claims, that Cetshwayo needed to disband his military, and this led Cetshwayo to respond by mobilizing thousands of Zulu warriors with an anticipated British attack coming. And the attack did come. The British initially in this war with the Zulu, and this is in the late 1870s, acted rather carelessly. They, I think probably saw the Zulu as primitives, people who could not possibly contend with them on the battlefield. This was done out of a great deal of naivete. And the British initially suffered a pretty serious defeat. A group of Zulu warriors, several thousand of them, descended upon a British encampment at a place called Isandlwana in January of 1879 and slaughtered over 1,500 British soldiers. But the British eventually got wise to the Zulu, and using their superior military technology were able to overcome them. And this was partly due to Shepstone and Dunn and others drawing away some contingent of the Zulu, making promises to them, and getting them to abandon Cetshwayo and their fellow Zulu. Right. So this goes to show how much the Zulu lacked absolute cohesion. Right. There was a great deal of contention over leadership among the Zulu. Not all those who considered themselves Zulu acknowledged Cetshwayo as their king. Right. And so a number of chiefs, along with their followers, defected from the General Zulu army, and this divide and conquer strategy enabled the British to overcome them. Okay, such that Ulundi, which was the royal kind of headquarters or capital, was destroyed in July of 1879. Cetshwayo was taken captive. He was exiled to Cape Town. He was later allowed to return. But he had to contend with others at that point for leadership, and the Zulu were never fully reunited again. The British abolished the monarchy. This, as I said, led to civil war between Cetshwayo and other claimants to the throne, and ultimately the Zulu capitulated. And Zululand, which up to this point, all the way to 1879, 1880, had been an independent country, was now incorporated into Natal. About 2/3 of the land that had been controlled by the Zulus was opened up to white settlement, and the British, in a measure that was a harbinger of things to come in South Africa, created what they called reserves. They took about 1/3 of the land of Zululand and declared that this was now the native reserve. This following the American practice of creating native reservations, except in this case the Zulu were existed in much larger numbers than the Native Americans did, due to the smallpox epidemics and other things among the Native Americans. And so, I mean, this wasn't like taking not that that was justified either, but we have a huge number of Zulu now living on about 1/3 of the land that they had controlled previously, and this overpopulation, a problem that had up to this point never been seen anywhere in Africa, would eventually become an acute crisis in certain parts of South Africa. Here's a good shot, by the way, on the slide of Rinderpest. This is an actual image from the 1890s of the cattle are all dead, right? So this had a tremendous impact on a number of these chiefdoms. To return to kind of the end of the story, at least up to conquest of the Xhosa, in 1872, the Transkei, so the region between the Kai River and Natal, which the Xhosa had been driven into as a result of the wars of the first half of the 19th century, was now annexed by Britain, and the Xhosa who were still reeling from the loss of their cattle in 1856, the whole Nonkawuse incident where, the prophecy about having to kill their cattle and all of that. The Xhosa had never recovered. And so what resistance did exist was little and sporadic. There were a couple of Xhosa chiefs, one of them named Sandile, which is a fairly common name among the Xhosa, even today. They did resist to some extent, but they were never fully unified. And the British allied with some of their rivals, especially the Mfengu, who we talked about. And so the resistance was overcome. The Rinderpest in the 1890s completely devastated the Transkei, maybe worse than any other area, except for the Tswana, who I'll talk about. And ultimately, much of the best farmland in the Transkei was seized by the British and opened up to white settlement. And the same had, of course, happened in other areas that the Xhosa had lived traditionally before this, right? So the Xhosa were reduced to just a few reserves. Many of the Xhosa had to, like other Africans, find work in the cities, in the mining industry, and the growth of industry, in the growth of manufacturing and other industries as well. And were, their traditional homeland was compromised severely. The Tswana, this is one of the most prolific people, at least in terms of the amount of land that they occupied in southern Africa. The southernmost chiefdoms had lived on land that was close to Kimberley, and of course, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in 1870-71, the land was seized. It was initially decided, because this territory was claimed by 4 different entities, as we talked about. Legally, it was decided that the territory belonged to Griqua Land West, so the Griqua people, who had formed their own kind of state there. But then Griqua Land West was also annexed by the British and controlled by them, and land was taken away from both the Tswana and from the Griqua there, right? The Tswana, and so the Tswana became heavily dependent on the whites for jobs, for their livelihood, and this is especially the case, again, like with the Xhosa, after the Rinderpest just completely destroyed their cattle. In the area north of the Molopo River, what is now the country of Botswana, this was a different case. This is a very dry area. This is into the Kalahari Desert. So the British were not necessarily interested in taking control of that territory directly. They did, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, feel a need to establish a protectorate there in 1885 to create a wedge between the Afrikaner republics and the now German-controlled territory after the Congress of Berlin. And there was at times tension between the Europeans and the Tswana there, but there were very few Europeans living in the area north of the Molopo River. And so the protectorate was a mostly independent, autonomous operating thing. The Rinderpest absolutely destroyed the Tswana, both those south and north of the Molopo River, though. And because their livelihood was destroyed, the very basis of their society was compromised so severely, many Tswana ended up, like other African groups, becoming dependent on jobs in cities. Many of them went to work in the mines or in manufacturing or other things. The Sotho, who of course had a greater amount of independence due to Moshoeshoe's skilled diplomatic maneuvering vis-a-vis the British and the Afrikaners. The Sotho would actually thrive in the early years of the diamond trade because the Caledon River Valley what was, I guess, the area south of the Caledon River Valley, which they occupied, was fertile farmland. The Sotho were few enough in numbers and the land was rich enough. They were able to produce a surplus there. And they made a livelihood by trading their surplus grain to the mining camps in Kimberley, and ended up being a fairly significant supplier of food to those territories. And this drew the attention of the British, and they, of course, decided to annex Basutoland in 1868, as we talked about. This was the bargain that Moshoeshoe made to try to head off the Afrikaner takeover of that territory. But after Moshoeshoe died, the British simply decided to turn Basutoland into part of Cape Colony, and to make sure that the area would be easily pacified, they issued a decree that the arms that the Sotho needed to turn over their firearms. This was actually a fairly common thing in Southern Africa. The Europeans would make laws or simply issue decrees from the colonial governments that stated that Africans needed to hand over their firearms, that it was illegal for them to own them. And of course, there was a good deal of pushback to this. When this disarmament decree went forward from the Cape Governor, the Sotho organized themselves and began to attack British positions. And the British really were not well interested or had the motive, the incentive to really put down these rebellions in Basutoland. And so, after suffering a couple of minor defeats, they never sort of felt the need to send in a large army there. The Cape government suspended the decree of disarmament and begged London to reassert control over it, to reform the protectorate there, which they did in 1884. And so the Sotho actually emerged in fairly good political position from this whole saga. But unfortunately for Basutoland, or Lesotho as it came to be called later, the good farmland that they controlled was too little to support the growing population there. I mean, when the population was fairly small in previous decades, it was okay, but the population of Southern Africa in general was growing precipitously during this period, despite things like disease outbreaks and wars and stuff like that. By the 1890s, by the turn of the 20th century, shall we say, the soil there had eroded precipitously and was no longer able to, well, certainly to produce enough food to render a surplus that they could then trade with the Europeans. And even, they were having difficulty feeding their own people, right? So, and this would become a problem in many places where the Africans were kind of forced into positions where their land was finite, where good farmland was at a premium. And so that trend will continue all the way through the 20th century. I will say from personal experience, you can see the effects of this in South Africa. I remember going to a place called Tabanchu, which is, well, it's in the Caledon River Valley. It's just to the west of Maseru, which is now the capital of Lesotho, though it is in South Africa. And I have never seen, I think, a place where soil erosion and things like this were so apparent, where the land simply did not sustain the human population. A lot of this has to do with the native reserves that were formed in the segregation era, something we'll talk about later on, right? But keep this problem of soil erosion in mind as we go forward. One final, very brief case study in Europeans taking advantage of, maybe the most egregious example of Europeans taking advantage of Africans. The Swazi king in this period was, well, ended up signing over. His name was Mbanzeni. He couldn't read or write English, well, European merchants, European farmers, European miners, gold prospectors, they kept going to him with written documents, and they would offer gifts, and these documents would state that he handed over, the right to prospect for gold, or the right to extract timber or whatever it was from certain territory within his kingdom, not understanding what he was doing, and simply seeing this as, the strange white man is bringing me gifts of guns or animals or alcohol or something like that. He signed his name. He signed an X to just about every document that was put in front of him. And through these rather underhanded means, Mbonzeni managed to sign over pretty much his entire kingdom to the Europeans. So these are the concessions that we're talking about here on the slide. The Transvaal, which had long had a goal of gaining access to the sea through Delagwa Bay, something we talked about earlier, decided to annex Swaziland. This was in the late 1880s, early 1890s. In 1895, Transvaal declared control over Swaziland. The British responded by annexing the little bit of territory just to the east of Swaziland to cut off the Afrikaners from having direct access to the sea. And then, the Transvaal claim to Swaziland was not anything this was simply a decree made by the leader of Transvaal. This is part of the escalating tensions between the British and the Afrikaners there. And so the British then sort of carved out Swaziland and proclaimed that it was more or less a British protectorate, even though they didn't necessarily use those many words. But because of all of these concessions that Mbonzeni had made, the British recognized those, and a significant share of the kingdom was henceforth legally in the control of Europeans. Despite the Europeans being very few in number in Swaziland itself. And that legacy for Swaziland would continue really all the way through the 20th century. The Europeans had legal control of much of that land, despite there being very few white inhabitants of that country. Now, in spite of all of these, just a couple of concluding points here. In spite of all of these setbacks for the Africans, for many, their lives didn't change a great deal. The Africans in the rural setting continued to farm, continued to pursue the lives that they were accustomed to, continued to eke out an existence from the soil. The setback of the Rinderpest and the loss of all of these cattle was a huge blow to them. But most Africans remained farmers, or at least that was a persistent way of life. This brought them into, this persistence brought them into tension with the European authorities. This is actually one of the things that Redding deals with in her book that's assigned for this week, right? I mean, this is a look at rural South Africans under European control. And the major means the Europeans had for exerting their control or their dominance over these rural native Africans was to collect taxes from them. Okay, the Africans, as Redding says, made the choice, at least in this early period, to pay those taxes because with the document that said they had paid their taxes, they gained autonomy. Right, in a way, this provided the same sorts of power brokering that had existed previous to European intervention at all in South Africa. That power was still wielded in very much the same way. People were incentivized to remain on the land and continue to work it, though in really the kind of larger machinations were much different than they had been. A good primary source document that shows, that point in a second, that shows the African concerns from this period is the one, it's in the Williams book, Part 3, Section A, document number 5. And this is an interview, or an interview or a kind of fact-finding mission of a British colonial official talking to people. I believe this is in the Transkei region. These are the Fingo people who were, some of the inhabitants of the Eastern Cape area, or the Transkei. And this inquiry is into their marriage practices, and they're specifically worried about the custom of lobola, the bride wealth that we talked about, right? And the European, this audience that the European official has is made up of some people who are not Christian and others who are Christian. And for the most part, though this is overgeneralizing, I think the Christians say, no, we need to do away with lobola. But then in some cases, even the Christians say, but I can see the point to it, like, women tend to be seduced less and to be drawn into extramarital sexual affairs than if they, if lobola is in place, right? But the point, and that's all very interesting and I think important, but as regards our purposes here, the section at the very end of the document, page 166 and 167, is highly revealing, right? And so they're writing here about they're involved, or rather these Africans who were interviewed are talking about their involvement in the Xhosa Wars. And they say, for instance, now in these, actually, let me go up a little bit. So it appeared at the conclusion of our work, they're talking about, having done work for the British government, that the government was pleased with us and gave us thanks, and then we would prove by the thanks they had given us that we were the government's children. Right? Notice the verbiage there. This is, here is the kind of clash of consciousness, or the colonization of the consciousness I think that Redding is talking about. These Africans are using their own parlance to describe what they perceive, when the British probably have a very different perception, right? So they are colonizing each other's consciousness through this, in this situation. And we ourselves had no desire for anything beyond the order by government with reference to our laws and customs, and we were satisfied with the laws of government as they appeared to be the laws of a father and mother to their children. And all this time, the government had not forgotten those men put forward as our leaders, right? So they granted us autonomy. But then some things happened that really confused us, they said, right? We were confused, and now we do not know what order to believe. And we begin not to understand what the government means and what we should do. When the Taleka War broke out, the war began as other wars had commenced. We did not know the origin of these wars. All we knew was that the government told us war had broken out in a certain quarter, and we went there. And when we went, we hoped, as usual, when we returned, that there would be thanks given us on the part of government. Right? So these are people who fought against the Xhosa, against the Taleka group of Xhosa specifically. And they thought, we'll serve government, and the government has been good to us, and they'll give us thanks. But on our return, and here's the key sentence, I think. On our return, the government did something which caused us trouble and anxiety. On our return from active service, we were told to surrender our arms. We said to the government, is the war over yet? The government said, yes, the war is over. There's peace everywhere. But then war broke out again, and these people are frustrated because they don't have arms, and they can't defend themselves, and they don't understand. These are Africans who are serving the British government as they see it on their own terms for their own benefit, and the government is making an effort to control their lives by taking away their weapons and things like this, right? And so that misunderstanding is really an important point, I think. And the Mr. Stanford, the British government representative, he responds at the end on page 167 by saying, well, look, this was only an inquiry into your marriage practices. These grievances you have brought forward are not for this commission to inquire into. You should represent them through the officer who is in charge of you, Mr. Jeffries, and I feel confident that any representation you make respectfully to government through him will receive due consideration, right? So this isn't my department. This isn't why I came here. Talk to the appropriate government official, and this is where the British are, revealing that their government is not really speaking the same language or functioning in anything like the same way that the Africans are accustomed to, right? So the whole thing breaks down at that point. So that, this colonization of consciousness, while at the same time this fundamental misunderstanding between the whites and the black Africans, is an important dichotomy that we see in this period and to some extent going forward. Okay. Last point, while the South African War, which we'll talk about 2 lectures from now, is seen primarily as a conflict between British and Afrikaners, Africans did suffer the consequences of it. Thousands of them were put in internment camps. They were employed as laborers and in some cases even as soldiers by especially the British. And this disrupted their lives tremendously, right? And that's something we cannot ignore. We need to look at the consequences of these momentous events, not just for the Europeans who were most directly involved, but also for the Africans who constituted the vast majority of the people of South Africa. Okay. So that's enough for now. We'll return to the discussion of the tensions between the Afrikaners and the British, though keeping in mind, what the Africans were experiencing at the same time.